Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. The Boundary Waters in winter is a place few dare to tread. Even the most experienced outdoorsmen approach it with caution. Its freezing winds, thick woods, and unrelenting silence can test anyone's resolve. For me, it was home. I'd been a park ranger there for nearly 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. But in January of 1957, something happened that I still can't explain. I'm not telling this story for sympathy or to scare anyone. I just need to get it out, to tell someone before it eats me alive like it did. Well, like it did them. It started with a call over the ranger radio. Reports of mutilated deer carcasses were coming in from hunters near Crooked Lake. Animals die in the wilderness all the time, but the description was strange deep gashes in the flesh, bones broken in ways that suggested unnatural force. One hunter claimed the bodies looked eaten. I took the report seriously, but chalked it up to wolves or maybe a bear desperate for food in the harsh winter. I told my 2 junior rangers, Danny and Paul, to gear up. Danny was just 22, fresh out of college, full of energy and confidence. Paul, 30, was quieter, steady, the kind of guy you'd want by your side in a pinch. By noon, we were driving through the icy back roads toward the lake. The snow had started falling again, heavy and wet. We parked the truck and hiked a mile into the woods. The snow muffled everything, making the forest eerily quiet. After a while, we found the first deer carcass. It wasn't just dead, it was torn apart. The ribs jutted out at odd angles, and the flesh was stripped clean in places. Claw marks raked across its flank, but they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. Too big for a wolf, too deep for a bear. Paul knelt beside it, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Bob, you ever seen anything like this?" "No," I said. Danny took a few steps away, scanning the area. "What's that smell?" he asked. I hadn't noticed it at first, but he was right. It was faint but unmistakable, something rotten, like meat left out in the sun too long. We found 3 more deer, all in similar condition, before we stumbled on the campsite. At first it looked like an empty cytotents sagging under the snow, a few supplies scattered around. But then I saw the blood. It was smeared across the snow in thick streaks, leading from the tents toward the trees. My stomach turned as I followed the trail. That's when we found them. The family. I won't describe what they looked like, partly because my brain won't let me relive it in detail, and partly because no one should have to picture that. They were torn apart, just like the deer. But this wasn't an animal attack. The bodies had been chewed on. Danny threw up in the snow. Paul just stood there, staring. "We need to call this in," he said. I nodded, but before I could move, something caught my eye, a dark shape hanging from a branch above us. It was a head. The head belonged to Roger, another ranger who'd gone missing 2 days earlier while checking traps in the area. His eyes were open, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. That's when I realized we weren't alone. The woods, which had been silent all day, suddenly felt alive. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, felt like it was coming from something watching us. Then the blizzard hit. It came out of nowhere, a wall of snow and wind that turned the world white. We could barely see a few feet in front of us. I yelled for the others to stay close, but the wind swallowed my voice. We tried to make it back to the truck, but the storm had erased our tracks. It felt like we were walking in circles, and then we heard Ida low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Paul was the first to go. 1 second he was beside me, the next he was gone. I turned in time to see something, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and antlers atop its head, dragging him into the trees. His screams cut through the storm, then stopped abruptly. Danny and I ran. We stumbled into a clearing, breathing hard, our faces stinging from the cold. I told Danny to stay close, but he was panicking, muttering to himself about how this couldn't be real. Before I could stop him, he bolted into the trees. I chased after him, but I was too late. I heard a sickening crunch, and when I reached him, I wished I hadn't. The creature, it looked like a man, but stretched and twisted in ways that shouldn't be possible, was tearing Danny in half. Its sunken eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then it dropped what was left of Danny and started toward me. I don't know how I survived. I ran, tripping and stumbling through the snow until I saw the truck through the trees. When I got back to town, I tried to tell the authorities what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said it was a bear attack, that the storm had made me see things. But I know what I saw. I can still hear Danny's screams when I close my eyes. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I hear that growl again. It's out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting. And it's hungry. If you think that was unsettling, the next story might keep you up all night. The desert sun hung low over Zion National Park, casting long, jagged shadows across the red sandstone cliffs. My name is Frank Thompson, and back then, I was the senior park ranger for this corner of the park. I knew every trail, every rock formation, and every narrow slot canyon like the back of my hand. At least, I thought I did. It started with a call. Nothing unusual, really. Two hikers, Dan and Margaret Peterson, hadn't checked out from their overnight permit in Echo Canyon. Not alarming in itself. People misjudged their time all the time. The Petersons were experienced, so I figured they'd just gotten turned around. I radioed for two junior rangers, Eddie and Paul, to meet me at the trailhead. Both were solid, dependable guys. Eddie had been with us a few years and had a knack for finding lost hikers. Paul was new, just a couple of months in, but eager and strong. We grabbed our packs, extra water and flashlights, then started up the trail as the sun dipped behind the cliffs. Echo Canyon is breathtaking during the day, its narrow walls twisting like a labyrinth carved by centuries of wind and water. But as the light fades, those walls turn into towering monoliths, choking out sound and trapping a deep, unnatural silence. About 2 miles in, Eddie spotted something, a bright blue scrap of nylon fluttering from a thorny bush. Margaret's backpack. It was shredded, the straps hanging limp like torn skin. "That's not from a fall," Eddie muttered, kneeling beside it. He lifted a piece of the fabric, now crusted with dried blood. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Could be an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. We pressed on, the unease growing heavier with every step. About 100 yards further, we found the first real horror: intestines. They were draped along the canyon wall like someone had deliberately placed them there, their wet, glistening coils shining in the beam of our flashlights. Eddie cursed under his breath, and Paul turned green, looking like he might vomit. "Stick together," I ordered. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. We followed the trail of blood deeper into the canyon. The Petersons' footprints bear now, for some reason, veered sharply toward a narrow fissure in the rock face. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but there was no mistaking the dark smear of blood marking the entrance. "Do we go in?" Paul whispered, his voice trembling. "We don't have a choice," I said. "Stay close, and keep your eyes open." The fissure opened into a cavern, its walls slick with moisture that smelled of copper and rot. Our flashlight beams danced across jagged rock formations, casting warped shadows that seemed to move on their own. That's when we found the first body. It was Dan Peterson, or what was left of him. His head was gone, cleanly severed, and his body was pinned to the wall with long, sharpened stakes. His skin was missing, peeled away in strips that lay crumpled at his feet like discarded clothes. Paul gagged, doubling over as Eddie swore, his voice cracking. I forced myself to step closer, scanning the ground for tracks or any sign of what we were dealing with. The cave seemed to hum, a low vibration that crawled up my spine. "Something's not right," Eddie whispered. "We need to get out of here, now." Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the cavern, a deep, guttural clicking, like bones snapping under pressure. It moved too fast for us to react. One moment, Eddie was beside me, his flashlight beam steady on the wall. The next, something huge and black blurred past, and Eddie was gone. His scream cut off abruptly, leaving only the wet sound of flesh tearing. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Paul's arm and dragging him toward the fissure. We barely made it out before the thing slammed into the opening behind us, its claws raking against the rock. I caught a glimpse of a mass of sinewy muscle and elongated limbs, its face a featureless void except for a jagged, lipless mouth. Paul was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know," I said, pulling him to his feet. "But we can't stop. Keep moving." We scrambled back toward the main trail, the creature's guttural clicks echoing behind us. We reached the canyon's narrowest stretch, a slot, barely wide enough for a person to pass through. I shoved Paul ahead of me, turning back to shine my flashlight into the darkness. It was there, crouched low, its body contorted in impossible angles as it squeezed through the fissure. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of serrated teeth that glinted in the light. I pulled my revolver, the one I carried for mountain lions and other predators. My hands shook as I fired 3 shots. The echo was deafening, but the creature didn't flinch. It just kept coming. "Frank!" Paul shouted from up ahead. "Come on!" I turned and ran. The creature's clicks growing louder, faster. When we reached the canyon's mouth, Paul stumbled, falling hard onto the rocky ground. I grabbed his arm, hauling him up just as the creature lunged, its claws swiping inches from my back. Then it stopped. It stood there, just inside the canyon shadow, its head tilting as if studying us. And then, slowly, it backed away, disappearing into the darkness. We radioed for backup and returned with a larger team at dawn. But the cave was gone. The bloodstains, the intestines, even Dan's body, everything had vanished. The Petersons were declared missing, presumed dead. Eddie's disappearance was harder to explain, but the official report chalked it up to a rockfall. I resigned a month later. I still wake up some nights, hearing those guttural clicks in the dark. Some things in this world don't want to be found, and sometimes they find you instead. What you've heard so far is just the beginning. This next story is even darker. I've been a park ranger for most of my life, 40 years to be exact. And during that time, I've seen plenty of things most folks wouldn't believe. The wilderness is vast, unpredictable, and unforgiving. It's not a playground for the faint of heart. But what happened in the summer of 1972 in the Great Smoky Mountains, that's the one thing I've never been able to shake. It started with a missing hiker. That wasn't unusual. People underestimate the Smokies all the time. A scenic hike can turn deadly fast when you lose your bearings, and the mist doesn't help. Thick, suffocating fog rolls in unexpectedly, swallowing trails and turning the familiar into the unfamiliar. The hiker was a college kid, bright-eyed and eager. His name was Greg. His parents said he was always careful, always left notes about where he was going. But his last note just said, Klingman's Dome to Deep Creek. Back by Sunday, when he didn't show, we started looking. I led the search party myself, along with a couple of my rangers, Jeff, a rookie barely out of training, and Clara, one of the best trackers I've ever worked with. We combed the trail for days. We found his pack snagged on a low branch, but no sign of Greg. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. Then another report came in. This time, it was a family of 3 gone, without a trace from a campsite near Eagle Creek. Their tent was still there, supplies untouched. It was like they'd just walked into the woods and vanished. 2 disappearances in 1 week. That's when I knew something was wrong. By the 3rd report, a solo photographer who disappeared while taking sunrise shots, I called for a full investigation. The higher-ups brushed me off, saying it was probably a string of unrelated accidents, but I couldn't ignore the pattern. All the disappearances were clustered around the same area, a dense patch of forest near Andrews Bald. We set up a temporary station there, a small cabin we used for emergencies. Clara, Jeff, and I, along with 3 other rangers, stayed overnight to monitor the area and search during the day. At first, it was uneventful. Quiet. Too quiet. On the 3rd night, things changed. I was out back, checking our equipment, when I heard a low, wet, hissing sound, like steam escaping a broken pipe. It came from the trees, just beyond the edge of our floodlights. I froze, straining to hear, but it stopped as suddenly as it started. When I told the others, Clara frowned. Probably just an animal, she said, but her voice was tight. She didn't believe that any more than I did. Jeff laughed nervously. Maybe Bigfoot's out there, he joked. No one laughed. The next morning we found our first clue, a patch of grass near the tree line, wilted and blackened like it had been burned. But there was no fire damage, no ashes, nothing to suggest what could have caused it. Just a perfect circle of dead vegetation. Clara crouched beside it, running her fingers through the brittle blades. This isn't normal, she murmured. That evening, the mist rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen. It clung to the ground like smoke, twisting around the trees and swallowing the trail. We stayed close to the cabin, our flashlights barely cutting through the fog. That's when we heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, crunching the underbrush just beyond our sight. Clara shone her light toward the sound, but the beam was swallowed by the mist. "Who's there?" she called. No response. Jeff grabbed the rifle we kept by the door. "Stay inside," he muttered, stepping out onto the porch. The footsteps stopped. Jeff turned back to us, shrugging. "Probably nothing," he said, his voice strained. And then he screamed. I'll never forget that sound. It was raw, guttural, full of terror. Something yanked him into the fog, so fast we didn't even see what it was. Clara and I rushed outside, but he was gone. The only trace left behind was his flashlight, flickering weakly on the ground. We should have left then, packed up and run. But we didn't. I told myself we couldn't abandon the search, but the truth is, I was afraid to move. It was Clara who saw them first. We were standing by the window, peering into the mist, when she grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Bill," she whispered. "Look." At first, I didn't see anything, just fog and shadows. But then one of the shadows moved. It stepped closer, and I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with long spindly limbs and a body that seemed to shimmer, almost like it wasn't fully solid. Its face, I can't even describe it. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface that seemed to ripple like water. And then there were more of them. Dozens, maybe. They surrounded the cabin, their bodies weaving in and out of the mist like they were part of it. Clara backed away, her face pale. "We need to go," she said, but it was too late. The creatures moved fast, too fast. One of them crashed through the window, its long fingers wrapping around Clara's neck. I tried to pull her free, but the thing let out a low, hissing sound, and she started to convulse. Her skin bubbled and melted as if it were being eaten away from the inside. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to do something. But I couldn't move. I could only watch as Clara collapsed, her body dissolving into a steaming, viscous pool. The creatures didn't stop. They swarmed the cabin, their acidic saliva eating through wood and metal like it was nothing. The others didn't stand a chance. I heard their screams as I bolted into the woods, the mist swallowing me whole. I don't know how I survived. Maybe the creatures lost interest, or maybe they were toying with me. All I know is, when I stumbled out of the fog hours later, I was alone. I never went back to the Smokies after that. The official reports blamed the disappearances on wild animals and harsh conditions. No one believed me when I tried to tell them the truth. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when the mist rolls in thick and heavy, I hear that low, wet hissing sound, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting. The real terror lies ahead. Are you ready for what's coming next? It was the summer of 1978, and Mount Hood National Forest had never been busier. Campers, hikers, and day trippers came in droves to escape the city heat, leaving behind a trail of litter, illegal campfires, and worse. For someone like me, James Cooper, a veteran ranger with 2 decades under his belt, the job was equal parts babysitting and firefighting. I loved the forest, though it had a way of making even the toughest days bearable. On that particular evening, the forest felt different. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the pines. The usual forest sound, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, seemed muted, like the woods were holding their breath. I was on a routine patrol, checking out an area where hikers had reported finding mutilated deer carcasses. Animals die in the wild all the time, but this felt off. The wounds were precise, almost surgical, and the carcasses had been arranged in a circle. Probably some kids messing around, I muttered to myself, though the idea didn't sit right. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the radio on my hip crackled. "Cooper, come in," came a static-filled voice. It was Sarah, my partner for the night. "Go ahead," I replied. "Found something near Cold Creek. You might want to take a look." "Copy that." On my way. Cold Creek was about half a mile from where I stood, but as I turned to head that way, a sharp whistle cut through the air. It wasn't a bird or any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded human, but wrong. High-pitched, almost like it was mocking me. I froze, scanning the trees. "Hello?" I called out. But the only reply was silence. I chalked it up to nerves and continued toward Sarah's location, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I arrived at Cold Creek, Sarah was standing by the water, her flashlight trained on something half submerged in the shallows. "You're not gonna like this," she said without turning around. I stepped closer and my stomach churned. It was a backpack torn, waterlogged, and stained dark with what looked like blood. Nearby, I spotted a shoe tangled in the reeds. "Any ID?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Not yet. Looks old, though. Been here a while." Sarah and I had seen our fair share of gruesome things in the forest lost hikers. Animal attacks, but this felt deliberate. We bagged the items and marked the location for retrieval. "Let's head back," I said. "We'll report it in and let the sheriff's office handle the rest." But as we started back toward the truck, that same whistle echoed through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. I nodded, gripping my flashlight tighter. The sound was closer now, and it seemed to circle us, coming from a different direction each time. "We need to move," I said, keeping my voice low. The forest grew darker as we hurried back, our flashlights barely piercing the shadows. Then we saw it. At first, it looked like another ranger, same uniform, same broad-brimmed hat standing motionless about 20 yards ahead. "Hey!" Sarah called out. The figure didn't respond. "Hello?" I added, stepping forward. As my light hit the figure, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person. The face was wrong-stretched and pale, with hollow black eyes that seemed to drink in the light. "Run!" I whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm. We sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. The thing behind us didn't chase us in the usual sense. Instead, it seemed to be everywhere at once. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, it was there, just standing, watching. We stumbled upon an old ranger cabinone we used for emergencies. Inside, we bolted the door and shoved a heavy desk in front of it. Sarah was shaking, her face pale. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. The radio crackled again, but this time, the voice wasn't one I recognized. It was deep, guttural, and barely human. "Leave," it growled. Then came the screams. It started as a low moan, growing louder and more desperate, until it sounded like a dozen voices wailing in unison. Sarah covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. I grabbed my rifle, though I wasn't sure it would do any good. The door rattled, then stopped. The screams ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. Then Sarah's eyes went blank. She stood, moving robotically toward the door. "Sarah, stop!" I shouted, grabbing her arm. She turned to me, but it wasn't her anymore. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. "You can't stop it," she said. She pulled a knife from her belt and slashed at me, her strength far beyond what it should have been. I dodged, but she kept coming, her movements jerky and unnatural. Tears blurred my vision as I raised my rifle. "I'm sorry," I whispered before pulling the trigger. When I finally made it out of the forest, dawn was breaking. I was found wandering near the ranger station, covered in blood, muttering incoherently. They searched for Sarah and found nothing. The cabin was empty, the scene eerily undisturbed. I quit the job soon after. The forest no longer felt like home. It felt like something alive, something ancient and vengeful. To this day, I hear that whistle in my dreams. If that sent shivers down your spine, brace yourself for what's about to unfold. My name is Michael Walsh. I've been a winter patrol ranger in Denali National Park for almost a decade now. Most people imagine Alaska as beautiful, but during the winter months it's anything but kind. It's cold, so cold that it feels like the air itself wants to cut you down to size. The wilderness doesn't care if you survive, and honestly, neither does the park. I was stationed at the northern sector of Denali that winter. The snow was heavier than usual, the temperatures dipped lower than they should have, and the radio chatter was dead silent. Most tourists were long gone, and only a few researchers stayed behind in isolated cabins, collecting data on wildlife or glaciers. It was mid-January when things started. I was at the ranger station, trying to distract myself with an old paperback and a lukewarm mug of coffee. The boredom was almost worse than the cold. Then, just past 2 a.m., the radio crackled to life. "This is Research Station Kappa Distress." "Repeat? Anyone copy?" The voice was faint and choppy. I barely made out the words over the static. "This is Ranger Walsh. I copy. What's your status, Kappa?" For a moment, nothing but static answered. Then the voice returned, shaky and breathless. "Hell, they're here. Cold, so cold." The signal cut off. Kappa Station was a small research outpost about 15 miles away, nestled in the middle of nowhere. It was staffed by 4 scientists who'd been studying permafrost and climate data. They were experienced folks, not the type to spook easily or misuse the emergency frequency. I geared up immediately: thermal suit, radio, emergency supplies. I radioed the central station to report the signal, but the response was delayed. Winter storms often played havoc with communications, and my message likely wouldn't reach them for hours. I'd have to handle this alone. The snow was relentless as I set out on my snowmobile. The headlights barely pierced through the thick whiteout, but I knew these trails like the back of my hand. Still, a knot of unease formed in my gut. The voice on the radio, it wasn't just fear. It was panic. I reached the outpost after nearly 3 hours of grueling travel. The cabin was dark, with no smoke rising from the chimney. The wind howled around me, carrying with it an eerie silence that shouldn't have been there. I parked the snowmobile and approached cautiously, shining my flashlight on the snow-covered windows. No movement inside. The front door was slightly ajar, its frame cracked as if forced open. "Hello? This is Ranger Walsh. Is anyone inside?" No answer. I pushed the door open, my flashlight cutting through the pitch-black interior. The first thing I noticed was the cold colder than it should have been, even with the storm outside. The second thing was the smell. It was faint but metallic, like blood. The living area was in disarray, papers scattered, a chair overturned, and a mug of coffee frozen solid on the table. But it was the bodies that stopped me cold. All 4 researchers were seated around the room, frozen stiff. Their eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness. Frost clung to their skin, and their expressions were twisted in pain. I stepped closer, my breath fogging up the air. That's when I saw the surgical cuts. Each body had been dissected with surgical precision. Their chests were open, ribs spread apart like the pages of a book. Their organs were missing: lungs, heart, liver, all gone. But there was no blood on the floor. No sign of a struggle. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. Then I heard it. It was a faint, clicking sound, rhythmic and deliberate. It came from the back of the cabin, near the storage area. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I had to know. Slowly, I crept toward the noise, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The storage room door was slightly open, a faint blue glow spilling out. As I approached, the temperature plummeted even further, my breath freezing into tiny crystals. I peered inside and froze. Standing over a table was something I can barely describe. It was tall and humanoid, but its body shimmered like ice under the light. Its limbs were impossibly thin, bending at unnatural angles. It was hunched over a lifeless body-on of the researchers methodically removing something from their chest cavity. The creature turned, its face featureless except for two glowing orbs where eyes should have been. It stared at me, and for a moment I felt empty. Then it moved. I don't remember much after that. My instincts took over, and I ran. I don't know how I made it out of the cabin. I don't remember starting the snowmobile or navigating through the storm. All I know is that I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. I locked the doors and radioed for backup, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the receiver. When help finally arrived the next morning, I led them back to Kappa Station. The cabin was empty, the bodies were gone, and the snow outside was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. 4 rangers disappeared in the following weeks. Their bodies were found miles apart, frozen solid with surgical cuts identical to the ones I'd seen at Kappa Station. The official reports blamed the extreme cold and wildlife, but I know better. There's something out there in the snow. Something cold, methodical, and inhuman. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but no one believes me. Maybe they don't want to. I don't blame them. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint clicking sound in my dreams, and every time the wind howls, I wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some tales leave a mark, but this next one, it will leave you breathless. I've lived in Georgia my whole life, and most of it has been spent around the Okefenokee Swamp. I took a job as a swamp ranger back in the late 60s. It was a quieter life than most folks would want, but for me, it was perfect. The swamp was home. Its murky waters and whispering trees were as familiar to me as my own backyard. In the summer of 1986, something happened that changed how I see the world forever. I still have nightmares about it. It started with a routine call about an alligator attack. A hiker named Kevin Early 30s, new to the area, had been reported missing near Blackwater Creek. His girlfriend said he'd gone out early to take photos of the sunrise and hadn't come back. When the first responders found his camera bag floating near the bank, it seemed obvious what had happened. He got too close to the water, and a gator pulled him under. I was called in to investigate the area and see if we could recover the body. Alligator attacks weren't unheard of, but something about this one felt off. Kevin's girlfriend mentioned he'd been near the creek's mouth, a spot most locals knew to avoid. The water there was darker, slower, and colder than anywhere else in the swamp. Still, it was my job to check it out. So, I loaded up the airboat and headed out around noon. Blackwater Creek was quiet when I arrived, too quiet. Usually you'd hear the hum of insects or the croak of a bullfrog, but there was nothing that day. Just the sound of my own boots squelching in the mud as I walked along the bank. I found Kevin's tripod not far from where his camera bag had been discovered. The legs were snapped clean in half, and one of them had teeth marks embedded deep into the metal. It didn't look like gator bites, though they were too small and jagged. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. A trail of drag marks leading away from the water and into the trees. It didn't make sense. Alligators don't drag their prey out of the water, they pull it under. But the marks were clear as day-long grooves in the mud, like something heavy had been hauled inland. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. About 100 yards in, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a pile of bones, human bones. Some were broken clean through, others gnawed on like a dog's chew toy. Nearby, I spotted a ranger badge half buried in the dirt. The badge belonged to Mike Harris, a co-worker of mine who'd disappeared 5 years earlier. They'd said he probably fell into the swamp and drowned, but now I wasn't so sure. Before I could think too much about it, I heard a noise behind me, a wet, slapping sound, like something crawling through the mud. I turned around, and for a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was hard to describe what I saw. The creature was about the size of a man but hunched over, with skin that glistened like it was covered in oil. Its limbs were long and thin, ending in webbed hands with sharp claws. It didn't have eyes, just two sunken pits where eyes should have been. It moved fast. Too fast. I ran. I didn't even try to fight it, I just ran as fast as my legs would carry me, crashing through the underbrush and back toward the airboat. The creature was right behind me, hissing and gurgling like it was trying to talk. I made it to the water and jumped into the boat, cranking the engine to life. As I sped away, I glanced back over my shoulder and saw it standing at the edge of the creek, watching me with those empty sockets. But it wasn't alone. There were more of them. A dozen, maybe more, emerging from the shadows and slipping silently into the water. When I got back to the ranger station, I tried to tell my supervisor what I'd seen. He listened politely but didn't believe me. "Stress," he said. "You've been out in the swamp too long." But I knew what I saw. The next morning, a recovery team went out to Blackwater Creek. They found Kevin's body, or what was left of it, lodged in a nest made of bones and swamp debris. The team didn't stick around to investigate further, and neither did I. I quit my job a week later. It's been almost 40 years, and I still think about Blackwater Creek, about the way the swamp felt alive that day, like it was watching me. I don't know what those creatures were, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that hissing sound again. And when I do, I lock my doors and pray they don't come looking for me. They say fear has no limits. This next story will prove it. It was just another uneventful shift in Redwood National Park. I had been working as a night shift ranger for over a decade, and the stillness of the forest at night had always been more comforting than eerie. There was something reassuring about the way the trees stood tall, their silhouettes cutting into the moonlit sky. Nature, after all, didn't lie. Unlike people, it just existed. That night, I was joined by two junior rangers, Ben and Carla, both fresh out of the academy, eager to prove themselves. They buzzed with energy, which clashed with my steady, no-nonsense demeanor. Our task was routine: patrol the lesser-used trails, ensure no one was out camping illegally, and keep an eye out for wildlife straying too close to visitor areas. The third member of our team, Officer Trent, had been on the force as long as I had. He was grizzled and quiet, the type who only spoke when necessary. We split into pairs for efficiency. Trent and Carla headed toward the North Ridge, while Ben and I took the eastern trails. We agreed to meet back at the ranger station by 3:00 a.m. The night was calm, the distant sound of an owl punctuating the quiet. Nothing unusual at first. About an hour into the patrol, Ben and I reached a section of the trail known for its dense canopy. The trees grew so close together here that moonlight barely touched the ground. As we walked, my flashlight beam caught something strange. The soil along the path looked wrong. It was churned up as if something had dragged heavy equipment through it. But there were no tire tracks, no footprints, just these deep grooves that zigzagged chaotically, as though the earth itself had been clawed open. Could be a bear, Ben suggested, though his voice wavered. Bears don't leave marks like these, I replied. I crouched down to inspect closer and noticed something odd and acrid smell, like burning hair mixed with decay. It clung to the air, sour and invasive. I didn't say anything, but I could see Ben wrinkle his nose. He smelled it too. We radioed Trent and Carla, asking if they'd seen anything unusual on their end. Carla responded, her voice chipper but slightly crackling over the line. All clear here, just some raccoon tracks. Trent didn't say anything, not at first. Then, in his usual gruff tone, keep your eyes open. That was when I noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet, everything was dead still. No wind rustling the leaves, no nocturnal animals scurrying about. Even the crickets had stopped their incessant chirping. Ben looked around nervously. Is it always this quiet out here? No, I said. And I didn't like it. We continued down the trail, the unease between us growing heavier with each step. Ben kept glancing behind us, and I couldn't blame him. I had the same prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we were being watched. We reached the old firewatch tower, a structure long abandoned, but still standing as a historical relic. The smell from earlier returned, sharper this time, making my eyes water. Let's check it out, I said, my voice lower than usual. Ben hesitated but followed. The wooden stairs creaked as we ascended, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. At the top, we found the observation deck empty, but there was something strange scratched into the floorboards, a symbol, circular and jagged, like a spiderweb drawn by a drunken hand. I didn't recognize it, but it sent a chill through me. Let's head back, I told Ben. He didn't argue. On our way down, we heard a faint noise-like whispering, but too far away to make out. It wasn't coming from any direction in particular. It seemed to surround us, slipping in and out of the trees. Did you hear that? Ben whispered. I nodded. Stay close. As we hurried back toward the ranger station, the whispers grew louder, joined by faint footsteps that didn't match ours. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, and for a split second, I saw it something moving between the trunks. A shadow, but not like any shadow I'd ever seen. It was darker than the night around it, its edges shifting like smoke. Ben froze, his eyes wide. What the hell was that? I don't know, I admitted, keeping my voice steady. But we're not sticking around to find out. We broke into a jog, then a full sprint as the footsteps quickened behind us. The whispers became incoherent screams, a cacophony that seemed to pierce right through me. Ben was panting, nearly tripping over roots in his panic. I grabbed his arm and pulled him along. When we finally reached the station, Carla was waiting outside, her face pale. Where's Trent? She asked immediately. He's not back? I asked. She shook her head, looking terrified. I heard him on the radio a while ago, he said. Something's out there. We tried calling Trent on the radio, but all we got was static. Then, through the crackling, came his voice. Don't come back. It's watching. And then a scream, a blood-curdling, gut-wrenching scream that cut off abruptly. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my rifle and told Ben and Carla to stay put. "Lock the doors," I instructed, "no matter what you hear." I ventured out alone, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. The forest felt alive now, writhing with shadows that moved when I wasn't looking. I found Trent's patrol vehicle abandoned near the north ridge, its doors wide open. Blood smeared the driver's seat, still warm, and then I saw them, the shadows. They gathered at the edge of my flashlight's beam, twisting and folding into grotesque forms. One reached out, its hand dissolving into tendrils of smoke that licked at the ground. Wherever they touched, the earth seemed to melt. I fired a shot, and the noise rang out like a thunderclap. But it didn't stop them. They came closer, their whispers now forming words I couldn't understand. My head throbbed, my vision blurred. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over Trent's body. Or what was left of it. He had been turned inside out, his face frozen in an expression of unspeakable horror. I don't remember how I got back to the station. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and Carla was shaking me awake. Ben was gone. The door had been forced open, but there was no sign of struggle, just a faint trail of black soot leading into the woods. I reported everything to the authorities, but they chalked it up to a bear attack. Trent, Ben, and Carla were all listed as casualties of a freak accident. No one believed my story about the shadows, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind dies and the forest falls silent, I can still hear those whispers. What comes next isn't for the faint of heart. You've been warned. I've spent most of my adult life working as a desert ranger, and let me tell you, the open stretches of Death Valley are as lonely as they are beautiful. Miles upon miles of rugged terrain, silent but for the occasional whisper of wind or the distant cry of a coyote. I thought I'd seen it all: bone-dry riverbeds, stranded tourists on the verge of heatstroke, and even a couple of ghost towns. But nothing prepared me for the horror I'd face in that abandoned mining camp back in the summer of 1992. It started like any other day. I was on a routine patrol of the national park, making sure no reckless hikers had wandered off the beaten path. Death Valley in July isn't forgiving, it's an oven. And the heat can kill you faster than you'd expect. I was driving my old Jeep along a rarely used dirt trail when I caught a glimpse of something unusual in the distance. A crumbling wooden structure, partially hidden by a ridge of jagged rocks. Curiosity got the better of me. I stopped the Jeep, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed the ridge to get a closer look. As I got nearer, I realized it was the remnants of an old mining operation shack's rusted equipment, and the unmistakable mouth of a mine shaft, yawning open like a hungry beast. I'd heard rumors about abandoned mines scattered throughout the park. Some dated back to the gold rush, others were less than a century old. Most of them were off-limits due to safety concerns, and this one didn't seem to be on any of our maps. My radio crackled just as I was about to call it in. "Rick, you there?" It was Jim, one of the newer rangers on the team. "Yeah, I'm here. Found some old mining site off trail. Looks like it's been untouched for years. You know anything about it?" "Not ringing any bells." "You want backup?" "Nah, I'll just check it out real quick. Probably nothing." Famous last words, right? The camp was eerily quiet. The air was still, heavy with the faint scent of rust and decay. I poked around the main shack. First half of its roof had caved in, and inside, I found a few rotten crates and some broken tools. Then I saw it. On the far wall, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "Stay out. They hunger." It gave me pause, but I brushed it off as the work of some prankster. Still, there was something about the place that didn't sit right. The shadows inside the shack seemed too dark, almost like they moved on their own. I shook off the unease and stepped back into the blazing sunlight. The mine entrance loomed ahead of me. Against my better judgment, I decided to take a quick look inside. I had my flashlight and a good pair of boots. I figured I'd just peek in, make sure there wasn't anything dangerous, and head out. The temperature dropped immediately as I stepped inside. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing timber supports and crumbling rock. The air was thick, damp, and carried a faint metallic tang. I didn't hear anything at first, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of gravel underfoot. Then, faintly, I heard Ida low, guttural growl. I froze, shining my light ahead. The tunnel stretched into darkness, but there was nothing there. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing off the walls. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anyone in here?" No response, but the growl turned into something worsey, scratching, skittering noise, like claws scraping against rock. That was enough for me. I turned to leave, but the moment I spun around, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, just beyond the edge of my flashlight beam, was a figure. At least, I thought it was a figure. It crouched low, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. I stumbled back, and the creature let out a piercing shriek that echoed down the tunnel. I bolted for the entrance, my heart pounding like a drum. As I burst into the sunlight, I nearly collided with Jim, who had apparently decided to check on me after all. "Rick, what the hell?" he started, but his voice trailed off as another shriek came from the mine behind me. "What was that?" Jim asked, his face pale. "I don't know, but we're not sticking around to find out." We ran back to the Jeep, but before we could even get in, the ground beneath us started to tremble. It wasn't an earthquake, it felt more like something was moving beneath the surface, something massive. Suddenly, the mine entrance collapsed, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then they came, dozens of them, pouring out of the cracks in the ground, pale, hairless creatures with razor-sharp claws and mouths full of jagged teeth. They moved with horrifying speed, their shrieks blending into a deafening cacophony. Jim didn't stand a chance. One of them lunged at him, tearing into his throat before I could even react. I grabbed my shotgun from the Jeep and fired wildly, but there were too many of them. I barely managed to climb into the vehicle and floor the gas pedal. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creatures swarming Jim's body, ripping it apart like a pack of starving wolves. I made it back to the ranger station in a daze, covered in blood and dirt. I told my supervisor everything, but he didn't believe me. No one did. They wrote it off as stress or heat exhaustion. A search party was sent out to look for Jim, but they found nothing. No body, no mine, not even the shacks I'd seen. It was like the entire place had vanished. To this day, I still hear those shrieks in my nightmares. Sometimes I wonder if I really escaped, or if I'm just living on borrowed time. Whatever those things were, they're still out there, waiting. And if you ever find yourself wandering too deep into Death Valley, remember this: some places are better left alone. If you thought the worst was over, think again. This next tale is pure nightmare fuel. I've worked as a search and rescue ranger in New Hampshire's White Mountain National Forest for over 20 years. The job has its challenges: long hours, unpredictable weather, and the weight of knowing that every call you respond to might be a life or death situation. But I've always loved the work. It's rewarding, even on the toughest days. This story takes place in late January 1995. It was one of those brutal winters where the cold bites through even the thickest gear and the snow piles high enough to swallow entire trails. We'd received a call from the ranger station near White River Pass. A team of 3 rangers, Mike, Jenny, and Carter, had failed to check in after a routine patrol through the western edge of the forest. It wasn't unheard of for radio signals to get spotty out there, but after 48 hours of silence, we were officially on high alert. I was assigned to lead the search party. We had 4 people, including myself, and were outfitted with snowmobiles, emergency gear, and satellite radios. The plan was simple: retrace their route, find any sign of them, and bring them back. We started just after dawn. The air was sharp and heavy, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in thick clouds before vanishing. As we followed their intended path, the forest felt eerily still. No birds, no distant rustle of deer, just the crunch of snow under our boots and the occasional hum of the snowmobiles. About 10 miles in, we found the first clue: a shredded tarp caught on the branch of a spruce tree. It was frozen stiff, but the bright orange material stood out like a warning flag. Nearby, we found footprints, 3 distinct sets, heading deeper into the wilderness. They must have ditched their gear here, I said, though my voice wavered slightly. Why would they do that? Asked Sarah, one of my team members. I didn't have an answer. We followed the tracks for another hour until we came across something that sent a chill through me, colder than the winter air itself. A makeshift campfire, long extinguished, surrounded by scattered supplies. A torn map, a smashed radio, but no sign of the rangers. There were claw marks in the snow around the campsite, deep gouges that didn't match any animal I'd ever encountered in these woods. Sarah leaned closer to examine one of the marks. "Edward, these aren't bear tracks," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No," I replied. "They're not." As we pressed on, the terrain became more treacherous. The tracks we were following began to stagger, overlapping as if whoever made them had been running or stumbling. Then we found something even stranger. One set of prints veered off sharply to the right, leading directly into the mouth of an ice cave. The cave was massive, its entrance a jagged archway that glittered with frozen stalactites. A cold wind seemed to flow from it, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound like whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. "Do we go in?" Sarah asked. Her voice trembled now. "We have to," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The inside of the cave was like something out of a nightmare. The walls were smooth, almost polished, reflecting our headlamps in disorienting patterns. The air was damp and heavy, and the further we ventured, the louder the whispers grew. About 50 feet in, we found Jenny, or rather, what was left of her. She was encased in ice, her eyes wide open and staring straight ahead. Her face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. But the worst part, she was alive. Her chest moved ever so slightly, rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. Sarah screamed, dropping her flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the icy walls. "We have to get her out," Sarah cried, but I knew it wasn't possible. The ice was too thick, and Jenny Jenny shouldn't have been breathing. As we stood there, paralyzed by fear, a low growl echoed through the cave. It wasn't human. Before I could react, something lunged from the shadows. It moved too fast for me to get a good look, but its shape was elongated limbs, pale, almost translucent skin. It knocked Sarah to the ground, dragging her deeper into the cave before I could even draw my weapon. "Run!" I shouted to the others, but my voice sounded distant, swallowed by the cave's oppressive atmosphere. The next few minutes were a blur. I ran blindly, my breath ragged and my heart pounding in my ears. The whispers were deafening now, mingled with guttural growls and the faint sound of Sarah's screams. When I finally emerged from the cave, I collapsed in the snow, gasping for air. Two of my team members, Jake and Tom, were already outside, their faces pale and stricken. "Where's Sarah?" Jake asked. "She's gone," I managed to say. "We never found Sarah or Carter or Mike." The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead. I didn't mention what I saw in the cave. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I know that whatever is out there in those ice caves, it's still waiting. Every shadow tells a story, but this next one will make you question what's real. It was the summer of 1998, a year I'll never forget. Mammoth Cave National Park was alive with tourists, families snapping pictures, and school groups on field trips. As a rescue ranger, I'd seen my fair share of accidents, twisted ankles, dehydration, the occasional idiot who thought they could explore unmarked trails without a flashlight. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what we found in the depths of that cave system. The call came in just after 8 p.m. Two college students, part of a spelunking group, were reported missing. They hadn't checked back in with their guide, and night was closing in fast. Normally, we'd wait a bit longer before sending out a team. 9 times out of 10, people find their way back. But this was different. The guide swore he heard screaming before they disappeared, echoing through the caves. We assembled a team of 6 rangers. I was the oldest at 41, but I'd been working these caves for over a decade. Our youngest, Jake, was barely 23 and still green. He joked nervously as we geared up, his flashlight trembling in his hands. "Just bats, right? Maybe they freaked out when one flew by?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, maybe." But something felt off. The air was thick, heavier than usual. Even as we entered the main passage, I could feel a strange vibration underfoot, like the ground was alive. We followed the guide's last known coordinates into a narrow offshoot of the main cave, aptly nicknamed the Throat. It wasn't a tourist trail. The walls closed in fast, forcing us to go single file. The further we went, the colder it got. My breath misted in the beam of my headlamp, and every sounder boot scraping on stone, the occasional drip of water seemed unnaturally loud. It wasn't long before we found the first sign of trouble. A torn backpack snagged on a jagged rock. The contents were scattered water bottle, a flashlight with a cracked lens, and a notebook. Jake picked it up, flipping through pages of hurried sketches and notes. "Looks like they were mapping something," he said, holding up a crude drawing of what looked like a cluster of tunnels. I glanced over his shoulder. The lines were shaky, almost frantic, and several were marked with X's. Beside one of them, scrawled in capital letters, was a single word: "Don't." "Must have gotten spooked," I said, though my stomach churned. We pressed on. About 300 feet deeper, the passage opened into a small chamber. That's where we found the first body. He was wedged between two rocks, his head at an unnatural angle, eyes wide with terror. His arms were shredded, the flesh hanging in ribbons. Jake turned and vomited while the rest of us stood frozen, trying to process what we were seeing. "Animal attack?" one of the rangers whispered, though it didn't sound like a question. "No way," I said. "There's nothing down here big enough to do that." But even as I said it, I wasn't so sure. The cuts were deep, precise, almost like claws. We radioed for backup, but the signal was weak this far underground. All we managed to get through was a garbled, found body, continuing search. It wasn't ideal, but leaving wasn't an option, not yet. As we moved deeper, the air grew stifling. The passage walls seemed to close in, and an oppressive silence hung over us, broken only by the occasional drip of water. Then we heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, but too deep, too resonant to be anything I'd ever heard before. We froze, flashlights darting around the narrow tunnel. Nothing, just shadows dancing on the uneven walls. "Probably just the wind," I said, though my voice shook. "Wind doesn't growl," Jake muttered. The noise came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something scraping against stone. We picked up the pace, our boots crunching against loose gravel. Another few 100 feet in, we found the second body, or what was left of it. This one was sprawled face down, his helmet split in two. His legs were missing, and the stone around him was slick with blood. That's when the growling turned into a chorus. It was no longer coming from one direction but from all around us, reverberating through the tunnels. "Move!" I shouted, shoving Jake ahead of me. We ran, ducking under low ceilings and squeezing through impossibly tight gaps. The sounds followed, growing louder, more frantic. At one point, I glanced back and saw something, just a flash of movement. Pale, spindly limbs, too long and jointed wrong, disappearing into the darkness. We burst into a cavern, our flashlights sweeping over what looked like a mass of debris. But as we drew closer, the smell hit you's rotting meat, metallic and sour. It wasn't debris. It was a pile of bones, human bones, some still attached to shreds of flesh. In the center was what remained of the missing rangers, their bodies twisted and broken, their faces frozen in silent screams. Above us, clinging to the jagged ceiling, were the creatures. Their pale, translucent skin glistened in the light, revealing veins that pulsed with every movement. Their faces were featureless, save for a gaping maw lined with rows of needle-like teeth. One dropped down, landing just feet away from Jake. He screamed, and the sound set off a frenzy. The creatures swarmed, their movements a blur. We fought our way back through the tunnel, the creatures hot on our heels. One of the rangers, Sarah, tripped and fell. I turned in time to see her dragged into the shadows, her screams cutting off abruptly. By the time we reached the main passage, only Jake and I remained. The creatures didn't follow us into the wider chamber. Whether it was the light or the open space, I'll never know. We collapsed at the entrance, gasping for air as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. Backup arrived minutes later, but it was too late. 6 rangers went into that cave. 4 never came out. Officially, the park blamed a rock slide, claiming the bodies were too deep to recover. But I know the truth. I saw those things, heard their growls, smelled the death that clung to them. Jake quit the next day. I stuck around for another year, but I never set foot in that cave again. Even now, decades later, I can't close my eyes without seeing those creatures. And every so often, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear them, calling from the depths,